Thank you very much for joining us this evening, at least in the UK. Of course, different time zones in India, Chile, and everybody else around the world. So it's great to have you here. I'll make a start now. We had lots of people registering, as I said, so we're expecting other people to come onto the session, but we have an hour, so I'd rather get going now, if that's okay with you. So welcome to this webinar on design thinking for innovation organizational change. We're going to use the chat, which is on my right-hand side, for questions. We will have well over 100 participants, which, as I said, is fantastic. At the same time, that means that having a one-to-one interaction is not going to be easy. So, but if you have any questions at any point, please put them in the chat. I'll do my best to address anyone's issues or concerns. So Rishikesh, yes, the session has started, so let's get going. This session is intended to just give you an idea of some of the work that we've been doing around design thinking, particularly in relation to innovation organizational change. This is in general, but also I'll make some remarks about the current situation of the coronavirus and see how some of the principles and practices that we looked into over the years might be particularly relevant these days. So let me get going just briefly with an introduction. So please mute notification. Yeah, so I hope everybody can hear me fine. Right. So yeah, let me get going. So just an introduction about myself. I'm a professor at Warwick. I've been at Warwick since 2012. And at Warwick, I'm also the director of the distance learning MBA. I'm not going to bombard you with information about our programs. Some of you here already are part of the Warwick Business School family. I'll just say a couple of things at the end. But I've been director of the DL MBA for a year and a half, and we're very pleased with how the degree is going, and we're making quite a few changes to improve it over the past months, at least. My background is management and engineering. I worked at Cranfield, which is another business school in the UK, also in London and in Italy as well, which is clearly where I'm from, about 10 years ago. I work in three main areas, two of which are not entirely related to this talk this evening, so strategy implementation and performance measurement and management and improvement. I'll talk more about design thinking and innovation management, which, again, is one of my core areas of interest. I'll draw on quite a lot of the work that I've done since 2005, so I've been at it now for a good 15 years. And I'll make references to some companies. In some cases, I will not be able to name them. But just to give you an idea of the companies that I've worked with and or studied, they tend to be large private firms. So this is just a little overview. From the top left, Herman Miller is a company that makes office furniture. I miss Herman Miller, and in fact, I miss my office desperately. I don't know about you guys, but working from home, it's okay after a while. I dream of my office, frankly. We have kids at home that we have to homeschool, and it's definitely much better when I'm in the office. But seriously speaking, I also hope that everybody on this call is safe and healthy. We've been and are going through a very difficult period that has been disruptive in many, many ways, socially, family-wise, work-wise, and so on. And I really hope that you are all okay. But going back to this talk, so I tend to work with large firms, product-based, like Diageo. I've worked with car companies like Jaguar Land Rover, Volvo, Aston Martin, and so on, but also with more service-based organizations, airlines like Emirates, KLM, Virgin Atlantic, and so on, professional service firms like PwC, but also banks. So there's a few remarks that I'll make about these different industries, but just to say that this talk tends to draw my experience and work that tends to be with large private companies. It may be also with governments, but they tend to be relatively large firms, which means that some of the points that I'll make may be less relevant for startups or very small SMEs. It doesn't mean that it's entirely inapplicable, but there are some dynamics that you will see are not the same. So this just to give you a bit of an overview. Right, so what is the agenda for today? Well, I'll first give you a short introduction to design thinking. Just to give you an idea, I teach a module that is 5 days long on these things, so doing a webinar over an hour is somewhat challenging. I'm not going to speak all the time, so I'll definitely open up for discussion. even though with 161 participants is somewhat complicated, but I'll try. But I will spare you some of the academic backgrounds. I'll just try and come on to practical points as much as I can, but I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to where design thinking comes from. Then we're going to talk about some elements that I think are particularly defining of design thinking, and I'll spend a bit more time on the first one called exploration, particularly because of the current period we're in. So what is important to me is that we understand design thinking not as a sequence of steps, as we tend to look at many things in management, but as different elements that interact. So the first element I call exploration, which is very much about understanding our assumptions, why we do things in a certain way, what are our preconceptions, what are the established practices, and so on. And try to ask ourselves hypothetical questions about what if. What if we did things differently? What if we started to interact with different types of service users? What if we tried to introduce a new technology, and so on? Just quickly reply to Jeff, yes, the slides will be available, yes. The second element of design thinking I call ideation, which is very much about creating alternatives, generating alternatives. So trying to come up with something relevant and new. So it's a creative part of this. And so it might be about engaging with users in a different way, working with suppliers in a different manner, about creating a new line of service, and so on and so forth. And the third element is implementation, so trying things out. But what's important to me is that we really try to avoid what the vast majority of companies do, which is to see these as a sequence. This is my first point about design thinking. Design thinking is not a sequential process in the way we tend to think about processes. It's an iterative process. So visualizing it as a funnel or some kind of a step-by-step kind of defies the whole point. And I've seen this in so many companies. It can be that. It's an iterative process. So if you want to visualize it, it may visualize as a spiral, if you like geometry. But, it's something that goes backwards and forwards. So it's not that it's 1, 2, 3, but it's different elements that interact. And so I'll take them one by one, but the point is that we always need to go through different loops, if you like, up and down. So what I'll do now is to give you a bit of background, and then I'll take each one of these areas, if you want, elements, at a time, again, bearing in mind that this does not have to be interpreted as a sequence. So over the last 10, 12 years, there's been a huge interest in design thinking. So what you could call a design thinking wave for a variety of reasons. One is the fact that there is a lot more complexity in the environments we operate in terms of competition, in terms of disruption, and so on. Big changes in the ways in which individual users interact with providers of products and services, the whole idea of experiencing something, of user experience, and so on. And so design thinking has been at the center of this, together with other things that you may be familiar with, like agile and lean startup and what have you. But design thinking has been one of those things that has lasted now for some time. And but I have to say this, that now that I've spent quite a good time working on this and studying companies that do this, this is done in very different manners. And so what I want to do today is not to tell you the truth about design thinking, because it's not a religion, I'm not a preacher, but what I want to say is that there are certain elements of design thinking that I've seen work really well, and these are the ones that I'll concentrate on. And then there are certain elements that are not particularly relevant and or misunderstood, and those are the things that I'll talk less about, or at least show you why they're not that important. So, yes, Emmy, it's an hour. Hopefully it's not too much. I mean, I could go on until tomorrow morning, to be honest, but I think that you probably have more to do tonight. So just to give you a little run through, starting from the top left, if you want to read something from the beginning of design thinking as it's understood today, this is an article by Tim Brown, by the consultancy company IDEO in the US. Obviously, the title is Design Thinking, and you can download it for free. It's a good introduction of possibly the most popular version of design thinking today, which comes from professional design firms and what they do with their clients and their approach to problem solving and so on. But before then, there was a long history of design thinking and design science, mainly in academia, I should say. So it didn't really make it to practice that much. That is very connected to behavioral science. You may be familiar with the work of Herbert Simon and many others that have worked on, the psychology of individuals within firms, particularly. The main version of design thinking today is very much the one of designers, if you like. And also added to this is the thing that we've got more in the middle and top right, which is a strategy perspective on this. So very much about trying to reimagine the way in which we develop strategies in organizations. And so this kind of three-legged stool of behavioral science, so how people behave and how people frame and address problems, how designers tackle problems, and especially how they relate to users, and the rethinking of strategy. These are the kind of three different areas that have contributed to design thinking. And just to give you an idea of outputs, the top right, you've got the evolution of design thinking is a special issue that came out in 2015 on the Harvard Business Review. Again, you can download some of those papers. They've got interesting case studies of Samsung and others. The bottom left, you've got design thinking, a book that I also contributed to with some case studies. And then a recent issue of California Management Review just in February 2020. So there's plenty of resources. But as I said, the version that is possibly more popular, especially when I talk to people in companies, is the one of the top left, which is very much kind of summarized in this quote, if you like, from Tim Brown's book in 2009 about, there is a massive change in our business environments. We need to think different. And somehow thinking like designers, whatever that means, is the way we should go about doing this. So instead of relying on this perspective only, what I'm going to do is to draw on the three that I've mentioned and really take you through what I believe is effective, what I've seen work in organizations and what doesn't. Let me start with what doesn't. Sometimes it's useful to start with the negatives and then go for the positives. So the first point is this. You may be familiar with this expression of fitting a square peg in a round hole. Essentially, what happens in many, many instances of implementations of design thinking, and I'll take you through what I believe design thinking is and what are the main attributes. But what happens is that the most interesting bits get essentially taken out by organizations because they're very difficult to digest. So let's look at this quote. Design thinking means actively looking for new data points, challenging accepted explanations, inferring possible new worlds. And this scares the hell out of a lot of business people. So trying to do things differently, challenging accepted explanations, which is the point that I'm going to reinforce today the most, and really trying to do new things is very hard to accept. For any one of us that has worked in any organization, this will not be that surprising, I suppose. It's very hard to do things differently because of legacy, because of many things that we've done that maybe have worked in the past, and various reasons for rejecting or at least opposing change. So what happens is that some of the elements, particularly in the exploration phase or exploration part of design thinking, they get ruled out because they're very hard to do. So when I take you through that, let's reflect on why is it that it's so difficult to do and what are the kind of ways to overcome those barriers. Another thing that I want to say is that many times when I see and or run design thinking workshops, I see that there is some kind of an accepted view that design thinking is essentially something around brainstorming, some kind of a creative session with a bit of funky colors and furniture, a bit of fun, a bit of music. I mean, those things, of course, help. But the idea is that it's very much about, putting Post-its on the walls and having fun. And I just want to show you a quote from a recent interview that I did in a medical company that said, well, the way that I see design thinking being used in companies is a synonym for getting a lot of people in a room and pasting Post-its on the wall. People say, oh, it's design thinking. I did this workshop, so I'm not now a designer because a prototype, I had a user involved. And it's true. I mean, if you Google up design thinking and UCL images, this is the image that you get. Essentially, people with Post-its. And there's nothing wrong with Post-its. I mean, sometimes it might be a bit too much. This is a photo that I took in Holland of possibly a design thinking session on plein air. But it's good. It's good to have, Sandra saying a colorful brainstorm. Yes, of course. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. At the same time, the efficacy of that is questionable, and it really depends on what is it that we do during those workshops and following from that, as opposed to the fact that we're just satisfied with the fact of not being in those kind of gloomy gray offices all the time. And so the first point for me is design thinking is not just about post-its, and it's certainly not just about trying to do the same with a bit of brainstorm and a few touches of color. So Mukunda, that's right. So hopefully you can sympathize with what I'm saying. But the first thing that instead it is very much about thinking in a different manner. Okay, so Jeff is talking about sprint sessions. Absolutely, that's right. So the first thing is there is a reason why this is called design thinking as opposed to design something else. And the thinking bit is quite important, not just because it's a kind of cerebral activity only in our brains, but because there is a different approach to things. So in many things that we do in management and in others, like engineering, for example, as I was trained, they tend to belong to an analytical paradigm. We unpack problems, we break them down, we try to find solutions in either using data that we have or comparing with others. We may do, I don't know, benchmarking, for example. We may do a number of things. But essentially, we tend to apply analysis to find solutions to problems. And this can serve us well, but there are some moments in which this analysis may not work. And perhaps we need to deploy something else. So who is so brave to share their views about what could be a different paradigm? So instead of my red, find, what kind of verb would you put there? And when is it that perhaps an analytical paradigm cannot help you, right? What is it that we could do different? What if we don't find a solution? We can try, we can explore, absolutely. What else? Create, very good, absolutely, yes. So it is very much about trying to invent, imagine, create, all the verbs you're coming up with, yes. And these points are very important because they start from the assumption that the solution isn't there yet, right? And perhaps we need to make it, we need to create it, we need to develop it, and so on. But the approach, it's very different. It's not just about, well, okay, so let's be creative for half an hour and then let's go back to what we had. But it's very much about looking at things in a different manner, and I'll come on to that. And that requires a huge amount of difference from what we tend to do and deploy in organizations. And the first point is this, that very often we jump to conclusions. When we think about finding a solution, it means that we're into a problem-solving mode. Or if you don't want to use the word problem, which has got a kind of negative denotation, you could say opportunity. You could say, what is it that we can do to seize an opportunity or to exploit an opportunity? Well, the point is that design thinking puts as much emphasis on the understanding the question as much as it is to solving the question, right, and providing an answer. And this is very important. We tend not to do that. We tend to jump into solution, right? Whereas sometimes it's good to kind of step back and look at things in a different way. Where does the problem come from? Or where does the opportunity come from? Why is it there? How is it determined? Is it something that people agree on? Or maybe is it a legacy thing? And maybe things have changed. Trying to dwell in the problem is something that we are uncomfortable with. Certainly, many people would have problem solver in their CV. I'm not sure that many people would have problem framer or finding problems as a particular skill that you would like to highlight to a prospective employer. But at the same time, these are things that perhaps can be valuable in organizations. So let me give you just a quick example. This is an example of a bank that you may know. I mentioned it briefly before. For those of you living in the UK, there is a bank called Clydesdale in Yorkshire, which you wouldn't recognize perhaps if you're outside the UK, kind of mid-size, not hugely known nor innovative, I should say. But what they decided to do was to really rethink retail banking. If you think about the top picture as, of course, the stereotype of a past retail banking environment where you go to, I don't know, cash a check or whatever you do. I've not been in a bank branch for a long time. But, you know, the point for them was, okay, now people interact with banks in many different ways. And of course, the main point is that they don't necessarily want to come to the branch, and we need to think about this differently. And so what you've got on the bottom left is the first one that they opened a few years ago in London, in Knightsbridge to be specific. And then the one on the right is the one in Manchester they opened 1.5 years ago. That is more for B2B, so offering services to SMEs. But if you look at this example, what they tried to do was to really think about this in a different manner. So if you Google, you will find B Bank, that's the name, B, like the letter B. And today they kind of merged, and so they trade under Virgin Money, that you may know. So that's the name of the bank. So have a look if you want. But essentially what they did, just to explain the story behind this, was to really think about what kind of experience do we want to create. So instead of just perpetuating this idea that people want to come to a branch to open a bank account or what have you, and they don't, what is it that we can provide? How is it that we can relate to them? And it's really trying to challenge the status quo. And a lot of the assumptions that we may have, assumptions about how we operate, in this case, how the bank operates, what kind of service users appreciate, how do they want to relate to us, and so on. And this is really the kind of the core of this element that I called exploration, is really try to bring to surface a lot of the things that we assume. Sometimes we assume them for a very good reason. You know, it's very important to assume certain things when you're heavily regulated, perhaps, or where, you know, there are specific things that you need to do because you're supplying another organization, whatever you want. But in general, sometimes it's useful to try to have these difficult conversations of really trying to understand those kind of things. And yes, City, you're right. It is very much about this. At the same time, you know, all this idea of thinking, understanding, and so on, it's not so easy. We are much happier, if you want, and with much less discomfort when we try to go for solutions as quickly as possible. We try to solve the problem and so on. In the reality, we don't really solve the problem. We may address it for a while, but then it may pop up again. So let me just give you a bit of an overview and with examples of how this design thinking approach then differs from what we tend to do in management. And I'm going to use two extremes, if you like, but it's just to know the fact that it's not that design thinking is necessarily superior to any other approach that we have, but it's particularly useful in moments in which we want to trigger innovation and change. So if we want to optimize, if we want to exploit existing resources, if we know what we're doing, if we just need to plow on, design thinking might be a distraction. It takes more time, it involves more resources perhaps deployed, and so on. So it's not a cure to all ills, but in moments in which we want or we have to look at things differently, and as I said, in this period of lockdown, for example, one can step back a bit more and think about what is it that we could do differently? How can we change the way we operate? You know, it's very much about trying to look at things in a different manner. And you're right, Robert. I mean, it is about trying to create an environment where people can experiment, can come up with ideas, and they're not shut down all the time. So let me just give you a little overview. I'll try to be brief, but just to give a few ideas in a nutshell. So again, the slides are available at the end of this talk. But the thing that I've put here in the middle column, and then I'll put, of course, the one on the right, it's the starting point in most of the things that we do in organizations is about problem solving. There is an issue with the customer, with the technology, with the new service, with the product that we launched last month. Whatever the problem is, we tend to think about solving it. And if it's an opportunity, it's about exploiting it, right? And it's about going forward towards that. And it makes sense, right? It's about trying to seize the opportunity and so on. And the way we do it is by applying two types of logic, and I'll try to be quick. So inductive, which is we look at data and we derive patterns, think about big data analytics and so on, try to understand what's going on through data. Or deductive, we have an hypothesis of customers behave that way and we try out whether this is true or not. So we're testing an hypothesis. That's deductive. And we try to look at what we've got, right? We tend to base ourselves on data and so on, which makes sense. And we particularly look at what we do. So the products that we make, the service that we deliver, the technologies that we employ, even the business model that we adopt, right? And we tend to follow processes, which are typically linear, right? So I've listed a few here, there's plenty, but you know, stage gates in development, you may be familiar with. So stages of development and gates of decision. Waterfall, if you work in IT, will be from specification to delivery. Getting right first time is total quality management in operations, so trying to get it right in the first attempt of getting something in a process, for example. It can be a critical path in project management, whatever you like, but we tend to follow processes that tend to be step by step. We rely on functional expertise, right? So stage gate will be, you know, you've got the R&D people involved at the beginning, and then the engineers, and then the marketers, and so on and so forth. And the evidence that we try to collect is typically quantitative, We have tables, reports, benchmarking studies, and so on and so forth. Those things have served us very well for many, many years. Now, the trouble is that there are moments in which this doesn't necessarily work. For example, when the data quantitative are not there because it's something new. In that case, you can't really rely on analysis and optimization because you don't have the data to do that. In other cases, trying to have a process that is very much, step by step cannot serve the purpose because it's just too long and it needs to be more iterative and so on and so forth. So while this approach is useful, it tends to be useful in certain circumstances where we have data, when there is sufficient stability and so on. When we don't have it, then maybe we need to look at something else. And so that is the right-hand side of this little matrix, which is very much about, okay, so instead of jumping into conclusions, let's walk back a little bit, right, to have a bit of overview, yeah, and try to look at, for example, what are the assumptions that we have? Maybe we've always thought that people would want to buy a car. Instead, now they want to just use it. Maybe we thought that people want to go to a bank branch to open a bank account, but instead they don't want to. Maybe we thought that our competitors are only large pharmaceutical firms because we are a pharmaceutical firm, and instead there are lots of biotech firms that are much more competitive than we are, and so on and so forth. And it's right, Robert, also about qualitative inputs. I'll come on to that in a minute. But the point here is very much about, let's step back and try to understand what are the opportunities, what are and/or the problems that we've got, and where do they come from? So maybe the changes in user behaviors have been so big that now we can rethink our service. Now we've got an opportunity. We can step back and rethink. If we could get away from all the legacy that we've got, how could we provide the best service possible, right? Instead of just perpetuating the same processes and trying to make them better. And one way to do this, it's my second row, or third if you like, it's this, what is called in a very clumsy academic way, I'm sorry, but it's called abductive logic. There's nothing to do with kidnapping anyone. The point is about asking what if, speculative type of questions. So what if we started to interact with a new group of customers? What if we started to produce something that we've never made before? And so on. And it's very much about engaging with possible scenarios, possible approaches, possible ways of engaging, as opposed to just doing what we've always done, right? And it's very much about trying to look at this in an open way, right? So yes, I mean, people have now remarked about qualitative data, scenarios, absolutely, that's right. And the way we do this, it's also about not just looking at what we do or what we make, but it's very much about trying to understand what is it that users could do or could appreciate or would appreciate in their context. And this is quite important. As much as everybody says that they're very customer-centric or user-centric, as a customer myself, as a user myself, and as a person that studies these things, well, I will question that a lot. So most organizations that I've worked with are very much company-centered, not user-centered. Let me just get a couple of questions here. So would we right to assume it will manage not necessarily, Aditya. So yes, I mean, design thinking would be, it could apply to everybody. In fact, startups would apply this almost naturally. Sumit is talking about blue ocean strategy. Well, yes, if you apply design thinking, that may take you to the so-called blue ocean. Yes, because it gets you out of the competition that is red in the terminology. So narrative, what is the narrative to definitely work about is, well, that's right. But what we need to do is also to open up as much as possible. There's always time to get something down. But so Mukund is asking whether we can fit this in tight deadlines. It's not easy. You need to have time to explore. You can't just explore in 3 hours. If you want to try and do something new, you need the time to do it. And so a lot of the companies that I've worked with had to take their time, and they had to be protected, so to speak, right? So they had to have the time to explore and try things out. Otherwise, you can't do it. And you need to follow a different process. You cannot just have the same stage gate. You need to allow for example, an explorative phase at the beginning. That would be really the minimum. And so, questioning the assumption is indeed, as Rohit's saying, a key to move towards finding a solution. So I have to think things. Just a couple of more, and then I'll keep going. So Ramachandran is asking about staff and so on. I would say that first and foremost, it would have to be people from the organization that gets involved. At the same time, having a facilitator may be useful to break down the politics and also, again, to challenge the assumptions. It would be very difficult for somebody in a room with the CEO to challenge the CEO in many organizations. So you often need somebody that breaks that kind of cycle, or at least that kind of barrier, if you like. And so, absolutely, Robert, it is about trying to get them from the front line. At the same time, you need to allow for that kind of communication channel to arise. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do. So you need to break that kind of typical hierarchical silos and barriers, if you like. Let me just conclude this bit and I'll keep going. So, it is very much about focusing on users in their context, but adopting an approach that is not linear. And that's the point that I've seen being mistaken so many times in organizations. It is about trying things out over and over and over. So having prototypes, experiments, beta versions, whatever you call them, it's very much about try things out as soon as possible at the beginning, not at the end. What most organizations are familiar with are prototypes, experiments, and so on to confirm. So to make sure that you're on the right path. Instead, in this case, is to disconfirm, or at least to learn from something. Is a very different approach. From a cognitive and behavioral point of view, is very different, absolutely very different. So, it is about MVP. That's right, Mukunda. Yes, but it's very much about with that kind of learning ethos. And that is achieved through collaboration, because sometimes the knowledge not necessarily within the company, and at the same time also including not just quantitative evidence, which is of course very important. I'm a quant person myself, so I wouldn't say no to that. But it is about different formats. It can be qualitative data like interviews, it can be different visual formats, it can be storytelling, physical artifacts, what have you. I mean, it can be all sorts of things. As long, of course, that it's done in a rigorous way. You can do ethnographies in rigorous ways as much as you do regressions in statistics. So you can do both, and they bring you different type of content. And allowing for that content to be considered as valid is not easy, because very often we're kind of it sounds a bit suspicious. You've spoken only to 20 people, but we've got this data set with 2,000 current customers. Well, those 20 people are prospective customers that we've never worked with. And we have so much depth that we've started to identify different types of new users. And so that's possibly as relevant as your 2,000 responses to the survey. At what stage of DT can we tell that we already try the service product? As quickly as possible, as quick as you can. It can be a mock-up, it can be, it can be in anything. You can try it out as soon as you can. So let me just show you a couple of other things, because I also want to take you through examples. So these are the kind of main questions. And as I said, I wouldn't want you to use or think of these as a sequence necessarily, but you can do them as a sequence in a loop, right? So over and over and over and over. And you can fit this with Agile in part, at least, even though Agile tends not to have such a strong explorative phase. So Alison, you're completely right. Yes. So people, but that's the normative bias that we have, which is very much about trying to get confirmation for what we thought, and running a focus group or involving a couple of users kind of makes us feel that we're on the right path, which is somewhat contrary to what we're saying here, which is very much about let's try out, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We've tried it out in 3 days, and not something that we had to develop over 3 months. So, Robert, you're right. Why can't we? Or what if we did, right? So, just going back to my friends Herman Miller, this is an example that I use a lot, simply because I think it's great, but also because, as I said before, I really miss my office. So I'd rather be there as opposed to in the loft of my house. Some of the big changes in specific products or services come from a bit of time and quite a lot of challenging the existing. So, it's time consuming. Yes, it is, but it may give you something that is last time. And as Lara knows as a designer herself, this is an iconic design. That's right. So this is a chair called Aaron, and some of you may have or have seen. I'm going to do some selling here for my friends at Herman Miller. But, the point about this chair, that this is a sketch. This is the way it looks today. This is very much about, challenging the status quo. This chair came out in 1994, which is 26 years ago, quite a while. It has had a couple of little changes, facelifts, if you want to call it that way, but essentially it remained the same. And what these people did, in a nutshell, was really trying to engage themselves with a wider question. And this is something that I would really like you to think about in whichever industry you work. This is something that is incredibly powerful. If we try to step back a little bit, and instead of thinking about how do we make a chair, we actually start to think about comfort, for example, or how do we think about, for example, the way in which people collaborate in an office, or how people use an office in the first place, or why people go to an office in the first place. This is very different. Design thinking is not the same as R&D. R&D is very much focusing on research and development. Design thinking may be across. It can be down to prototyping, and then marketing, sales, and everything else. It encompasses the whole suite, if you want, of functions. It wouldn't be R&D only. But the point here is, how can we broaden out in terms of, instead of just looking at what we do, what is the thing that we're trying to achieve from a user point of view? And if we do that, then we can start to challenge the existing norms, if you like. So it is about, in this case, it would be about comfort, for example, right? In other cases, might be about convenience. In other cases, might be about a transformational experience, whatever you like. But if we abstract ourselves a little bit and we step out of what we do as opposed to what is it that we're trying to create in a wider sense, that can really take us very far, because we can do things in a very different manner. And this leads on to strong ideas. So what we call reframing in academic language is very much about looking at things from a different angle. So instead of looking at a chair, we look at an office or a way of collaborating. All the work that many airlines have done over the years, BA, Emirates, Etihad, and many others, but it's very much about starting to look at the overall experience of a passenger as opposed to going from A to B. And of course, the future of airlines is somewhat uncertain now, of course. But the way I've seen many airlines moving has been more and more expanding the concept of experience. So it's not just travel; it can be an overall experience of going to other places, adding other things, with you as a provider, not just giving you the Hertz link if you want to hire a car, but providing the overall package, and so becoming more like an agent, if you like, in general, as opposed to being an airline only. So, but this reframing can get us into looking at things from a wider perspective. Now, the problem is that need gap analysis, it is, yes, Simriti, that's right. Yes, it is about that, but it's also about sometimes trying to look at things from a different angle when users can't tell you that. This is another key principle here. So it's difficult. If somebody has been sitting in an office and wants a new chair, they probably look for chairs. They don't necessarily think about what materials might be making my sitting experience more comfortable. They wouldn't think that. We as consumers, as users, we tend to think of what we know and refer to what we have, as opposed to being able to look at things from a wider perspective. And that's why, as much as running focus groups and really trying to have discussions with existing customers, doing surveys, I mean, all of that is great. But if you want to get something new, it's very difficult. You're going to get that from the people that are already in that kind of space and already access that kind of service. I'm just looking at some of the comments on the chat. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely, the solution. That's right. And the cars were basically coaches with them. That's right. Yes. So, but it's very much about trying to see how things might be. And here's the difficult bit, right? The difficult bit is then now we need to make it. And there we have all sorts of issues, not just technical, but even more so cultural. So you may have seen this little vignette. This really is an innovative approach, but I'm afraid we can't consider it because it's never been done before. And that's the difficult bit of trying to do something that we have no evidence for entirely that something is going to work, right? So the point is about how do we get to work in an organization where there is a certain element of okay, we're okay with a bit of ambiguity. We're okay with the fact that maybe things are not going to work out the first time as we really hope, but we've got the ways in which we can try and do them differently and learn from experience. Consumer education, I guess, Vikash is referring to in the sense of saying, well, you need to socialize the new thing, because otherwise customers will not understand it. And if that's what you mean, absolutely yes. Because if you come up with something new and no one understands it, no one knows to operate it, no one knows what kind of features of services, whatever it provides, of course, you are a bit too early, so to speak. And the same happens inside the organization. So, just to give you a couple of examples, and then I'll show you two more slides. It's very much about, trying to think about also the way in which we operate. So one project that I did was about using design thinking to change the whole talent management process in an organization. Completely different way of approaching that, of going from, this was in a professional services firm, going from senior manager to director to partner and so on and so forth. They decided to redesign it entirely. And so they had to challenge the assumptions about what was a career, but also what were the attributes of the people that would lead the firm. It was a huge undertaking and very discomfort. There was a lot of discomfort in the company because we were really pushing on, what does it mean to be a leader in this firm? Big questions, very big questions, and without necessarily the certainty that this would work, but at least a very strong idea of we want to do it differently and we're going to try it out. And so let me just get through a couple of things and then I'll come on to the change management models. This is a quote from a bank. I was talking to the digital director there. And so he was saying to me, look, I think that there is a growing acceptance within the bank that if we're going to take this kind of design-led approach, we need to get used to failing sometimes. And if there is a failure, typically it's only remembered for a few weeks. Either learn from it quite quickly or get the next things out there and iterate very quickly. And that is really the point. The very point is, let's try it out and try and see what we get. But learning in this context is not just something that happens by chance, it's intentional. It's very much intentional. You're trying it out because you want to learn, not because you want to confirm. And this is very hard, absolutely very hard. Let me just look at a couple of points. Lara, radical rethinking of what defines career success. Absolutely, yes. And what are the attributes of successful people, if you like? And not all firms think that in this way at all. Not at all. No. I mean, the vast majority of the firms, companies that I've worked with, don't think about this in any way. For them, failure is a disaster, even if it's a small one. So very hard, but really trying to, strengthen ideas and to some extent even, reduce risk because you're testing over and over. So much better. That's right. So I'm just looking at cyclical learning. Absolutely, yes, it is like this. And so what we can do is, of course, we can try things out, right? So, you can prototype spaces, you can prototype services, you can prototype interactions, you can do all sorts of things. And, it's very much about this idea that we're not going to get it right first time. We're going to try it out. We're going to learn from something and then do it again and again and again. So let me just look at a couple of questions. So Jorge is saying, should design thinking implementation come from culture company or only from some project areas? I suppose you mean the corporate. So it can come from projects and or divisions as long as you have ways to kind of then disseminate this across. Now, it's difficult. If you are in a company that employs 200,000 people, what does it mean to apply design thinking? Is effectively what it means is that you apply to certain projects. You cannot just roll out design thinking in a year with 200,000 people. And I talk from experience because I worked in a company like that. At the same time, it doesn't mean that it cannot be facilitated across the firm. So it is very much something that can be done from top down, but you definitely need to do it bottom up. So decoupling. So let me just look at a couple of other points. Wouldn't try and again exploit the resource and organization. Not necessarily, no, because you could try it out in a variety of ways. You can partner up with others. You can explore new collaborations. You can bring in external people. So it doesn't necessarily have to be exploiting resources within the organization. And you can use some of these elements within what you're already doing as much as something you can do for something entirely new. Let me see when. So some software we're using, design thinking. I can send you more stuff about this. This is more technical. So Jagan, through the should operate in iterative mode. Unfortunately, there are always timelines. That's right. Yes. I mean, to some extent, if you look at some of the known cases of really doing design thinking, you need to create that kind of space for people to experiment and explore. Because if you don't have that, it just doesn't work. if it falls apart. Because if people are really pushed in a kind of deadline sense over and over with very tight deadlines, it's very hard to do this. It's very hard to explore when you've got a deliverable tomorrow that is trying to essentially reduce as opposed to expand the scope of what you're doing. So, it's quite tricky. Let me just see, sorry, a couple of other ones. I was working for a company which wanted to see roll that design thinking for everyone. Yes, you can, as long as you roll it out properly. Because what I've seen being done in large companies of that size is that it becomes essentially a step-by-step process. And I've worked with many of those. So I cannot name names. Maybe it's one of those that you worked in, but it's almost inevitable. If you try to do this quickly, you end up with a kind of bite-sized version where everybody goes on to a one-day program, which is kind of a bit worrying, to be honest. Let me just see Pietro's comment. Can all companies learn this way of working? They can, maybe slowly. They don't necessarily need to use external facilitators, but it's a big cultural change for many organizations. So it tends to take a bit of time, and you may need a bit of skill. People can be skilled. I mean, that's why we teach it on our programs at Warwick, I have to say. But of course, we hope that this then becomes current practice, and of course, you'll be one of them. Same thing is started implementing. Yeah, that's right. In many organizations, we see design thinking being introduced because of crisis. And that's what I was saying, in the current period with so many things going on in terms of disruption and not knowing what's going to happen and so on, maybe it's an opportunity. One of the few good things about the current situation might be that we can step back a bit more and maybe rethink some of the stuff that we've always held to be true. So it is about trying to do things in a different manner. Let me just wrap up, and then I'll take a few more questions. So let me just go through this slide. Now, the point for me is and again, the slides will be available if you want to go through them again, but it's very much about trying to understand design thinking as an iterative process of going backwards and forwards between different elements, if you like. And as I mentioned before, the one that I'm particularly interested in, because it's the one that goes out of the window the first, is the explorative one. So really trying to step back a bit. Don't get into problem solving yet. Don't get into delivery yet. Don't get into step-by-step yet. Hold off a little bit. Try to think about why are we doing things in a certain way? Couldn't we do them differently? If we could do it again, would we do it the same way as we're doing now? Probably not. Are there things that are changing around us in terms of user expectations and experiences, in terms of technology deployment, in terms of supply chains and ecosystems? I mean, you can throw in so many things that are changing, and trying to understand how things vary, and so how we can rethink what we do. And what if we did it differently? What if we tried something else? And it doesn't have to be, putting the whole company there. It might be a small pilot. It may be some kind of an experiment. It might be one partnership with a company that we've never worked before, whatever that is. But it's very much about trying to do this, right? And this is really a key component of that. Then, of course, we can ideate, and there are many other techniques to do that, so I didn't have time to cover. And we can prototype, experiment, and so on. And, if you use Agile, for example, that will be connected to that. If you do minimum viable products and so on, that will be connected to that. But what design thinking brings that other approaches don't necessarily bring is very much this idea of problem framing and reframing, which, as I said, it's not something that comes natural to us because we tend to solve, not necessarily frame. So, there's plenty of stuff up there. If you're interested, I've written just a couple of LinkedIn posts on that, one on design thinking, one on different business logics. I compare design thinking to analytics and to typical strategy implementation stuff, if you're interested. If you're more academic inclined, with a few colleagues, I did a full review of everything that has been written until 2019 on design thinking. That's the first paper. And the second one is the use of design thinking in marketing, if you're interested. Let me just show you. So these are my contact information. And I've only got a couple of things to say about Warwick to close, but let me take a few more questions. Hopefully I won't trigger an avalanche, because I know that we need to finish at 7 UK time. So having had at least twice less work experience than most of the. That's right, yes. So, in some MBA programs, you get exposed to design thinking a lot, in others not so much. We do have a module on innovation creativity. We also have a module with, in collaboration with Aalto in Finland, on design thinking. And but design thinking is an elective. If you speak about I think if you speak about the MBA, I also teach it to MSc students, and again, there will be an elective. It's a course that it's a module that many people take, but it's not a core, or at least not necessarily in all the programs that we've got at Warwick. Francisco, how does success of design thinking approach look like when outcomes detach from short-term financial performance? Yeah, that's right. I mean, the short-term financial performance in terms of a little increase on operational efficiency, probably not. You tend to look at sales from new products, sales from new services, customer uptake, new product, so NPS, and so on and so forth. Those will be the typical metrics that you would use. I tend to go quickly because I see a lot of questions. So, Xaba, can you start the process without a vision? Oh gosh, hold on. So I'm afraid of dropping the results of vision. You need to have a driving vision, but also, as I said before, this kind of protection, if you want to call it that way, of who is going to work on a certain using design thinking needs to have their time a little bit protected. Because if you don't do that, then essentially they will revert back to the typical logic that we have, which is the problem-solving logic. Mayor's is talking about international business. Yes, we do offer that. It's called Design in Business. I run it with Haley here. Mukunda, can design thinking be applied to analytics? You can, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can learn. In fact, you can use them together if you want. So you can think about how certain things could be done differently, and then, well, depending on the data that you have or the type of algorithm you write, you could use it. In fact, the last project that I did was about companies implementing design thinking alongside digital transformations. So yes. Alexander's just checked WS Library, and there is a good number of DT articles there to check. Absolutely, yeah, we've got plenty. Is a part of guys talking about entrepreneur track? It might be, but MBA, MSc students can select it across. So City has got quite a long one. Gosh, I feel anything you can apply anything to everything. Absolutely, yes. You can apply to a variety of contexts and so on, and you can implement it in relation to any form of what is it that you do. You know, it can be a service, it can be a product, it can be a combination of the two. It can be a business model if you want. So it can be a variety of things. Sumit, how DT as a skill can explore new job profiles in the future? I hope so. Yes, this will become more and more popular. It is, but it's also a cultural shift in many organizations that we need. It's very much about this idea of not seeing failure as a disaster, but actually as something that in small quantities we can bear and we can learn from. That requires quite a bit of cultural change. So yes, it's becoming more and more established, but it takes a bit of time. Freya, does time protection mean that a ambidextrous organization will be useful to combine design thinking? This is an academic question. Yes, why not? Absolutely, especially in the explorative part of ambidexterity. Absolutely. So design thinking could apply to that one. Mactuno, are there any recommendation links for design thinking for corporate strategy? If you look at the California Management Review special issue that I mentioned, 2020, there is a couple of papers that look at strategy and design thinking. Yeah. Thank you. Someone says skill. Okay. Thank you. Can you share a few examples of organizations taking DT and working and work for them? Yes. So I mentioned a few. So as I said, Herman Miller is a very good example. I think they did really well. Some of the projects that we did with Emirates, which is a client of ours at Warwick, would have been in that field as well, of around customer service, but also in changes that they brought about, for example, to their finance team, their redesign and so on. So that will be another one. Some of the work that medical companies have done has been really good. If you look at the Philips and also the GE MRI scanners, these are typically documented cases that you can look up about how they really made a difference in MRI scanners, especially for kids, in fact, and improving the rate of effectiveness of those. So those will be good examples. Just a couple of ones. Is this what interactive DL lectures are like in terms of number of students? No, sometimes students are fewer, but we try to address all the questions as much as I can. Jagan, we use DT and is working decently. We're scaling up to double further. Very good. Yes. So I'm glad. You know, there's plenty of resources out there. Let me just say a couple of things. So as I said, if you want to read this, you know, we have plenty of programs at Warwick. I'm not going to argue with stuff, but you know, we offer elements of design thinking, if not design thinking modules, as part of the MBA, where we have the full-time distance learning, which is the one that I am director of, and the MBA. We have executive education programs, for example, one for Emirates where we talk about design thinking and so on, and also other programs as pre-experienced masters, etc. And I run sessions for DBAs. If you don't know what it is, you might be interested in PhD program. I teach on most programs, and there's plenty of information on WBS website. So Tet and others, if you're interested, have a look. Let me just answer the last couple of questions before I need to close. So, are Max in relation? I'll come back to Sam, but no, in this case, there's really many people, and talking will be really difficult. Leonel, in terms of content, so precaution be taken on plans and thinking. Yes, you need to manage expectations. You really have to manage expectations, because if people think that you're going to come up with a revolutionary idea that is going to win you the Nobel Prize, maybe the expectations are a bit too high. So one needs to manage that. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't, but that's the point. It doesn't give you certainty, but it gives you innovation. It gives you something different. In some cases, of course, is very positive and radical. In cases not, but then again, the point is that you're going to learn from that and doing it again. So managing expectations is probably one of the main points. Thank you guys for the comments. Let me just see a couple of other ones. Looking at the strategies, I'm thinking maybe suggestions for organizations. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I mean, design thinking, as I said, it's not it doesn't ensure that you're going to live 100 years. It's not, and it's not the solution to everything. So if you're an organization that's going okay, in a stable environment, it knows what it's doing, competition is stable, in fact, maybe it's even a monopoly or something, then interesting design thinking requires quite a lot of a push, and you wonder whether there are results coming from that in terms of return on the investment. If you are instead in an organization where the context is dynamic, you're trying to do different things, competition is changing, then probably this is one thing that you will need to look into quite a bit. So thank you very much, Jeff, Petra, thank you guys. Gosh, there's too many questions. I've lost track. Hold on. Thank you. Okay, I'm just checking if there's any other question before I stop. Yeah, thanks a lot for I could just recommend Warwick MBA. Thank you, Francisco. Brilliant. So yes, thanks everybody. Okay, so we're at the thank you phase. So brilliant, thanks a lot. I'm sorry if I didn't manage to get into everything that you asked, but I really tried. So user experience, Jeff, absolutely, user experience. But again, looking at the experience of the user, not necessarily asking the user. That's one of the other principles that we touched upon. So again, thank you so much, everybody. The slides will be made available. Recording will be dead. And thanks a lot for making the time. Brilliant to have so many people, and brilliant to have so many people from around the world. Stay safe and healthy. It's a tough period. We'll get through it. And if you've got any questions, please contact me or the team. We'll be very happy to reply. So thank you very much again, and have a good evening if you're in this part of the world or wherever you are. Thanks again. Goodbye.